This week, after Xi Jinping welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin to Beijing, the Chinese leader said his country's relationship with Russia had reached, quote, the highest level in history, unquote. Their meeting came only a few days after a high-stakes visit from President Trump to China. I'm joined by Richard Haass, former top State Department official, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and the writer of a great Substack, as well as Kishore Mahbubani, who is a veteran Singaporean diplomat and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Richard, we now have a kind of interesting dynamic between these three great powers in the world, where everyone's getting on a little bit better, I suppose, but the Russians and Chinese do seem to have formed a kind of axis.
I'd call it an alignment. It's not quite an alliance. The last I checked, China's aid for Russia is, shall we say, finite. It's limited. It's also very much a relationship between unequals. That, to me, was the lead part of Mr. Putin's visit, which is how much he's become almost a supplicant, pushing China to open up this new pipeline, almost more for Russia's economic benefit than for China's. So I don't think it's all that significant. It also highlights the difference. China's a multifaceted major power. Yeah. Russia's pretty limited, pretty one-dimensional. And by the way, the last I checked, it's not winning its war of choice against Ukraine, and it's paying an enormous price for it. So Russia's going to emerge much weaker as a result of what it's doing.
You made this point, Richard, in I think on X, that Russia and the United States are both, went to China, and in similar circumstances, they are both losing their wars of choice, one in Ukraine, one in Iran.
Yeah, for all the differences between the wars, that's the bottom line. They're both going to emerge worse off as a result. The really interesting point for me, Fareed, just what Kishore thinks, is what message China takes from that. And when Xi Jinping sees this, does he say, maybe these wars aren't so obvious. They don't turn out the way you think. So I'm hoping this might be a moment of some sobriety, if you will, for Xi Jinping.
Kishore, how do you think Xi Jinping is looking at these two wars of choice where the United States and Russia are both floundering?
Well, I think from China's point of view, in many ways, things couldn't be better now. Because the United States very clearly now is stuck in the Gulf. And so in that every war that the United States fights in the Middle East is a gift to China, because it buys time for China to keep growing its economy and to become stronger. And at the end of the day, the Chinese are always playing the long game. They're trying to figure out where they'll be 10 years from now as a result of the current developments.
But when you look at, when they look at how difficult these wars have been, despite Russia's massive asymmetrical advantage, and it's much bigger than Ukraine, the U.S. is much bigger than Iran, do you think they look at that and draw a cautionary lesson about Taiwan?
Well, the way the Western media describes Taiwan is absolutely wrong. And I say this because everybody thinks that China is just preparing to try and invade Taiwan militarily as quickly as possible, and then seeing whether or not the examples of Iran and Ukraine will apply to Taiwan. And here again, I must emphasize that the Chinese take a very comprehensive long-term view and ask a very simple question. On whose side is time on? Is time on Taiwan's side, or is time on China's side? And trust me, if the Taiwanese declare independence tomorrow, which is what will cause a war, how many countries are going to recognize Taiwan? When I was in Taiwan a few months ago, I told the Taiwanese people, you're lucky you have a Republic of China passport, which brings you to over 180, 190 countries. You change your passport to Republic of Taiwan, you'll be lucky if 5 or 6 countries recognize the Republic of Taiwan passport. So time is on China's side, on Taiwan. Obviously, they're going to emphasize that the power they're accumulating is on their favor. They're going to show signals of strength, but they're not in any way dreaming of a military invasion of Taiwan anytime soon.
All right, stay with us. We're going to talk about all this and more when we come back. And we are back with the President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, who writes his excellent Substack newsletter called Home and Away, and Kishore Mahbubani, who is a veteran Singaporean diplomat and writes in more conventional publications like Foreign Affairs, but very well indeed. Richard, we were talking about who has the advantage in terms of time, China or Taiwan? Whose side is time on? And Kishore makes the point, of course, China's the bigger economy. They will get larger and larger over time. That's clearly the Beijing strategy. Do you agree?
I actually don't. China right now is, 1.3 billion people? By the end of the century, it's projected to be closer to 800 million. The ratio of working age people to people who are elderly is going to move much in the direction of the latter, of the elderly. Defense technology is increasingly through drones and anti-ship and anti-aircraft systems moving in favor of defenders. So I actually think that could help Taiwan if they adapt that. The key variable, I think, is the United States. I actually agree with Kishore to a bit. China doesn't want to do an invasion. There's no Chinese soldier who's fought in a war. To do a combined arms
since
invasion.
the Korean War, if you take Vietnam out of it, which was a very brief war,
and so they were basically all retired. So I don't think they what they want to do, almost in the principle of Sun Tzu, they want to subdue their enemy without having to fire a shot. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on us. So the real question coming out of the summit, in that interview that President Trump did with Bret Baier on Fox, is the United States prepared to trade off support for Taiwan for economic access to China's market? If he's willing to do that, then China might get its wish.
Kishore, I've always thought that the real thing deterring China is not the U.S. military, but it is the fear of losing access to the American market, the European market, the Japanese. China wants to sell to the world. It's integrated into the world economy. That's why I tend to agree with you. They're not going to willy-nilly invade Taiwan, but that's the deterrent, that more than the American military.
Let me make 2 points in response, okay? The first point is this. What's the big lesson that Iran is teaching us in the Gulf? You don't need superior military weapons to seize control of a choke point, okay? You don't need the best military in the world. Iran doesn't have the best military in the world, and guess what? It's held up 20% of the world's economy. Now, in the case of Taiwan, all the Chinese have to do is to say Taiwan is off limits. Okay, isolate, blockade Taiwan. They don't have to fire a shot. Trust me, nobody's going to break a Chinese blockade on Taiwan. I mean, let's get serious about this area. If the Chinese declare that they are serious, people will take them seriously. That's my first point. And the second point, your point about selling goods to the world. Selling goods to the world is a two-way relationship. This is one statistic everyone should understand. China's share of global manufacturing in the year 2000 was 6%. Now it's close to 30%. By 2030, it'll be 45%. And you know what that means? Chinese products are becoming indispensable to the world. Absolutely indispensable. Now, the Chinese have created this dependence on China for a very powerful, deliberate reason to ensure that no American containment policy of China can succeed.
I have a short amount of time. You have a thought?
Well, China's also dependent on exports. China has not allowed domestic demand to grow naturally. They've repressed it. Why? So they've got this export-led economy. So they need access as much as we need their goods. So I think that's also a constraint on China.
Which is why I tend to think, I think Kishore is right. It's a two-way street, but for both. And the real deterrent would be if the U.S. and Europe and Japan and Australia would all come together and say, if you invade Taiwan, it won't be business as usual. Which, by the way, we could do, except that we are quarreling with all our closest allies, levying tariffs on them and making, far from presenting a united front, we have worse relations with Canada now than we have with China.
That was the strategic argument for joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We could present a united front. This is the great strategic advantage of American foreign policy. We wake up in the morning, we have dozens of partners and allies. What have we done? We've undermined our own fundamental strategic advantage.
Kishore Mahbubani, Richard Haas, always a pleasure to talk to you guys. Next on GPS, college students are graduating into one of the worst labor markets in years. Is AI the culprit? I will explore that next.